In this video, we will understand what is the double spending problem and how Bitcoin solves it. So for that, I will try to create two transactions. First, I will create the transaction where I'm sending few coins to this address. Let's say 29 Bitcoins and send. It will take few seconds because it is also broadcasting the transactions to the other miners. We will fix that. We will first add the transaction in the memory pool and then we will broadcast the transaction to other miners so that this screen will be responsive and it will not wait for this long. And now the transaction is added in the memory pool. Now I will create one more transaction wherein we are sending few coins to this address, let's say 59 Bitcoins. And again, once the transaction is in the memory pool, I will show you what's the issue. Alright, so both the transactions are in the memory pool now. Let me open up the memory pool. So we have two transactions here. Let me open up the first transaction and then second transaction. So let's see what all transactions we are using to send these coins. So in this transaction, we are sending 50 Bitcoins. So which means we need to combine two transactions so that we have enough money to send the coins to this address. So the first transaction is 393 and the second transaction is EA. Now go to this transaction where we are sending 29 Bitcoins to this address and see we are using the same transaction again. So this is exactly what is the double spending problem. We cannot let anybody use the same coins to spend it twice. In our case, double spending problem is generated because when we try to create the transaction, we read the data from our UTXO list. Let's say we have created the first transaction and by default, it will read the first transaction from the UTXO list and it will create the transaction. Now this transaction is still there because block is not yet mined. Now if we'll try to create the second transaction, again it will try to read the first transaction by default from the UTXO list and it will refer the same transaction which we have already used, and that is what is causing the double spending in our case. And now we will see how to fix this problem. Go back to VS Code. We can easily solve that problem by simply verifying the previous transaction ID. So let's create a list here, previous transactions, and then let's create one function here, double spending attempt self, and this will receive the transaction. And we can check in this function for transaction input in tx.tx_ins if txin dot previous transaction not in self dot previous transaction. So let's create this self instead of previous transaction so that we don't have to pass this parameter to the function when we will call it. If it is not there in the list, then add it in. So we can do self dot previous transactions and then add this transaction in it, txin dot previous transaction ID. So when we create the transaction, so transaction input has the reference of the transaction that we are going to use. So we are simply checking if we have already used the transaction, and then we should not allow it to use it again. Now here I can do else return true. Return true means it is a double spending attempt. Now I can call this function here if self dot double spending attempt, and we can pass the transaction. So this is the transaction that we are going to pass. And we can check if not double spending attempt, add the keyword not, then only do this. Otherwise, in the else part, we will take the reference of the transaction so that we can delete it later from the self.memory pool. Now make sure you should not try to change the memory pool here, otherwise it will give you the error. So we can create one more temporary list here, delete tx or tx, and I can add it here, delete tx.append and add the transaction ID. And then here Once we are done with everything, we can do for exid in delete transactions, and then delete self dot mempool, remove it from the memory pool, and then remove the transaction. And this is txid here. Let's quickly verify if we have done everything correctly. And right here, this is not a dictionary, so we should do append and remove these braces. And that's all. Now this will restrict all the users from double spending the coins. Now let's test our code. Set the breakpoint here. Start it in debug mode. Go to wallet. And I will try to create 2 transactions here. In first transaction, let's say I will send 45 Bitcoins. And in the second transaction, I will send the coins to this address, and let's say 102 coins. All right, so both the transactions are submitted. Go to memory pool, and we have 2 transactions. Open up the first transaction and the second transaction as well. Now let's verify. We have first transaction 393, then EA and F74. Go here. We have same transaction 393. Now let's go back in our code and try it. Back to VS Code. Check if it is a double spending attempt or not. And first time it is not, and it will work as usual. Now the second time, if we'll try to check, now it should give us the error. As you can see, it is in the else part, and now we will remove the second transaction from the memory pool, which is this one, F3. Now let's do it. And now the transaction is added in this append list, and now we will remove it from the memory pool right here. First, let me show you the transactions. We have 2 transactions here. Now let's execute this part, delete it, and now it's gone. Let's check it here, and you can see we have only 1 transaction. Now only this transaction will be included in the block, and we have successfully resolved the double spending problem. That's it for this video.